I felt completely out of place. That one scene, it just hit differently. I started feeling this deep, sharp pain shooting straight up into my ear. At first, I thought maybe it was just anxiety. But then came the heart palpitations. I told myself, okay, maybe it's just the pressure of this moment. But deep down it felt like something else. This wasn't just a role. These were sacred words. Words once spoken by the holiest man to ever walk this earth. It felt wrong. Like I wasn't worthy. Like I was standing on holy ground without shoes, unprepared, undeserving. It's easy to look at the final product. The lights, the perfectly shot scenes, the miracles that come alive on screen. But what people don't see is the emotional and spiritual weight an actor carries when he's portraying Jesus Christ. This isn't your typical acting gig. It's not just about memorizing lines or hitting marks. Playing Jesus means stepping into something sacred. For Jonathan Roumie, this role became something far more intense than he ever imagined. Millions were moved by his performance in The Chosen, but few knew what was really going on behind the scenes. While audiences saw a calm, powerful, and divine Jesus, Jonathan was silently battling something unseen, and it nearly broke him. This video will reveal the full depth of that battle, and by the end you'll hear how a lightning strike on set became a moment of divine clarity for him. It all started during Season 2, right before filming the Sermon on the Mount. A massive scene. Hundreds of extras. Silence on the set. Cameras ready. And Jonathan right in the middle, preparing to speak Christ's words. But then something hit him hard. Out of nowhere, a sharp, almost unbearable pain pierced his ear. His heart began to race like he'd just run a marathon. His hands shook. Breathing became difficult. No fever, no prior symptoms. Just a sudden rush of fear and panic that didn't feel natural. Something unseen, dark, almost oppressive. In that moment, it didn't feel like nerves or performance anxiety. It felt like a force trying to shut him down. He turned to Dallas Jenkins, the director. "Can we pause for a second?" he asked. Jenkins looked concerned. "What's going on?" Jonathan pulled him aside and tried to explain. "I don't feel okay," he said. "I'm saying these sacred words and hearing them come from my mouth doesn't feel right. I'm not worthy." And this didn't just happen once. These attacks came on the days where the scenes held deep emotional or spiritual weight. Moments about forgiveness. Scenes involving miracles. Anything involving Christ's power and grace. The more meaningful the message, the heavier the pressure. The anxiety came back again during filming of The Last Supper. It started as a tight feeling in his chest. Then came the same unexplainable pain in his ear. His heartbeat began to thunder again. This time Jonathan didn't try to push through. He didn't pretend everything was fine. He quietly reached out to his spiritual director and sent a simple but urgent message. "Please pray for me." His spiritual advisor replied instantly, saying, "I'm praying the rosary right now." Within just 15 minutes, the symptoms faded. The pain disappeared. His breathing returned to normal. And just like that, the fear lifted. That moment became a turning point for Jonathan. This wasn't about physical health. It wasn't just stress. It was spiritual warfare. And it was real. He was under attack, but not in the way most people would understand. He said later, "I believe these spiritual attacks show up in so many forms. Some of it might look like anxiety, sure. But deep down it's something else. Something trying to interfere. Trying to make me mess this up. Trying to keep me from honoring Jesus the right way." That fear stayed with him for months. It changed the way he prepared for scenes. Some days he couldn't even rehearse. He sat in silence, overwhelmed, unable to speak. Other days tears would fall without warning. The words he had practiced over and over, Christ's words, suddenly carried a weight he wasn't ready for. He described one moment, standing on set, completely overtaken by emotion. Not because of the pressure of acting, but because of the sacredness of the words. He looked around at the people, the crew, the cast, and he just whispered, "Sorry," under his breath. The emotion, he later explained, wasn't just about the scene. It was about the journey. That moment reminded him that the journey was nearing its end, and he wasn't ready to say goodbye to it. The cameras kept rolling. No one moved. And for a second, Jonathan felt like he wasn't acting anymore. Something divine had taken over. The lines between actor and role had blurred. He was no longer performing Jesus, he was being used to reflect Jesus. That weight spilled over into his off-screen life too. Jonathan began praying more. He added fasting. He committed himself to confession. He wasn't just portraying Christ. He was walking closer with him. But as that closeness grew, so did the spiritual battles. "You face higher levels of spiritual warfare the deeper you go," he said in an interview. And when asked how he fought those battles, Jonathan didn't hesitate. With prayer, he said. The Rosary. Divine Mercy. The Angelus. Every single weapon we've been given. He admitted that he'd become hyper-aware of spiritual attacks. He could feel them coming sometimes. And yet he kept moving forward. Because the role wasn't just a job anymore. It was a mission. But that mission came at a cost. Jonathan recalled another scene and said, I just felt completely out of my element. These weren't just words on a script. These were Jesus's actual words. And I was saying them in front of real people. I kept thinking, what am I doing here? That raw honesty only deepened the power of his performance. He wasn't trying to impress. He was trying not to get in the way of something sacred. And offset, his personal relationship with Christ began to transform. People who'd worked with him years ago noticed the difference. One friend said, 5 years ago when we were filming The Two Thieves, you weren't like this. You weren't this tuned in, this connected to Jesus. And that observation was right. Jonathan had changed. He had grown spiritually in ways even he didn't fully expect. Playing Jesus didn't just change his career. It changed his soul. God, if this is what you want, if this is really the path I'm meant to walk, if this is why I'm on this earth, then you've got to help me. Because I can't keep going like this. I've been trying, I've done everything I thought you wanted from me, but it's not working. So here it is, I surrender. It's yours now. You take the reins. And it was on that very day, something shifted. A few things happened, circumstances changed, doors opened, and for the first time in a long time it became clear. This is how it's going to be. Full surrender. Dallas Jenkins and Jonathan Roumie remember that moment vividly. The entire cast and crew were on set. Extras stood quietly, almost reverently. This was no ordinary day, this was the filming of the Sermon on the Mount. Jonathan stepped into the frame, his robe catching the breeze. Hundreds of eyes were on him, and soon millions more would be watching from around the world. He opened his mouth to deliver the lines, but something wasn't right. Something spiritual. Something deeper than what the camera could capture. And in the middle of all that, everything just started to unravel. Visually the scene was simple. In fact, on screen we barely even see Jesus delivering the sermon. Most of the focus is on the people, on their reactions, their emotional responses. Because in The Chosen, it's rarely about just the miracle or the words themselves. It's about the human response to Jesus. That's why at first, Dallas wasn't overly concerned. This wasn't a heavily technical scene. The lighting was perfect, the sound was crisp. But something invisible was off. It wasn't about a poor performance. It wasn't acting. It was like a spiritual fog had descended. Dallas could sense it too. He looked at Jonathan, who was clearly overwhelmed, on the verge of breaking. And then he made the call, cut. They stopped filming. The weight of the moment was just too heavy to continue. Jonathan later explained how he felt in that moment. He said, I'm saying these words Jesus once spoke to real people, and I'm standing in front of all these extras, and suddenly I thought, who am I to do this? Why me? He was overcome. He felt unworthy, unsure, deeply human. But then came the reminder. He said, I know I'm here for a reason. Someone else isn't here, and I am. So I have to honor that. God trusted me with this role. He trusted me to portray his son. I can't dishonor that. That day wasn't about messed up lines or scene direction. It was spiritual warfare. The kind that shows up when truth is about to be spoken. Because when you speak Jesus' words out loud, darkness listens. And it doesn't like it. It pushes back. The more light the Chosen brought to the world, the more resistance they faced. God had placed Jonathan in that role for a reason. But it wasn't easy. Every time they pushed deeper into truth, into portraying the message of Christ, they faced opposition. Production delays, financial obstacles, illness among the cast, and spiritual attacks, especially on Jonathan. He described it as a form of resistance, intense, invisible, and very personal. Sometimes it came in the form of physical sickness. Other times, it was emotional heaviness. Occasionally the atmosphere on set would shift. But it was always there. Whenever they filmed a key moment in Jesus' life, something would go wrong. People often ask Jonathan, what's it like to play Jesus? And his answer is always the same, it's impossible. You can't play Jesus, he says. He's unplayable. And he means it. How do you wrap your mind around the divine? Around perfect love and holiness? Around the hypostatic union, Jesus being fully God and fully man? He says, I don't know what it's like to portray divinity. I only know what it's like to be human. And even that, I fail at. All I can do is bring my humanity, my intention, my desire to honor Christ. Jonathan says he constantly prays for the Holy Spirit to work through him, to guide him, to take over. He says his job isn't to perform but to get out of the way. And even when the physical attacks on set would stop, the spiritual burden didn't go away. Filming moments like the Sermon on the Mount, the Last Supper, or the crucifixion came with an emotional and spiritual intensity he never expected. But it also gave him something else, a deep, real connection to Jesus. People have developed such affection for Jesus through this show, he says. And that's exactly the goal. That we would not just respect Jesus from a distance, but love him, feel a connection to him, want to be near him. He says, I think that's what's going to happen when people see the crucifixion scenes. When Jesus gets slapped, I think people will go, hey, I know that guy. Don't do that to him. That's the power of this portrayal. It makes Jesus feel close, personal, real. Filming for season 5 has already begun, and Jonathan says the new episodes are emotionally intense. We're filming Holy Week, he explains. Jesus entering Jerusalem and everything that comes after. When asked about his schedule, he admits it's grueling. Long days, emotionally heavy scenes, and a constant need to stay grounded spiritually. As they move closer and closer to the crucifixion scenes, the emotional and spiritual exhaustion only increases. I don't want to complain, he says, but honestly I'm tired. I'm coming out of a really intense season. And yet, he continues, because this story matters. And he's not the first to go through something like this. Jim Caviezel, who played Jesus in The Passion of the Christ, went through unimaginable suffering on set. While filming the crucifixion, Caviezel was actually struck by lightning. His shoulder dislocated. He developed pneumonia. He nearly died. And yet he kept going. I wasn't afraid, Caviezel said. If I die, I go to heaven. During one take, the sky darkened. Thunder rumbled like a cannon. The ground shook. Crew members nearby stared in shock, their eyes watering. Caviezel's hair stood on end. The atmosphere was charged. The suffering was real. And the audience gasped, because something beyond the physical was happening. It wasn't just acting. It was an encounter with something holy. Jonathan has reflected on that story, not with fear but with deep understanding. When you step into the life of Jesus, even just as an actor, it's not just a role. It's an invitation. An invitation to suffer with him. To experience, even in a small way, the weight of what he carried. And that invitation became very real for the chosen cast during a key crucifixion scene. As they filmed, a storm rolled in. The skies turned black. And then, lightning struck the cross. It wasn't CGI. It wasn't a special effect. It was real. And it stopped everyone in their tracks. Not a single person moved. No one said a word. Everyone just stood there shaken. They knew this wasn't coincidence. Jonathan later talked about that moment. About how it echoed what happened to Caviezel. About how it felt like a supernatural sign. A reminder of who this story is really about. And as they prepare to film even more emotionally and spiritually weighty scenes, they're taking nothing for granted. We're praying for clear skies, Jonathan says. We're doing everything we can. But we know, this isn't just a production. It's a spiritual battle. Did he tell you what that felt like? I mean, seriously, that's just insane to imagine. The way he talked about it wasn't dramatic, it was calm, almost peaceful. He somehow made sense of it as being part of Christ's suffering. That everything he endured, whether it was a dislocated shoulder, heart surgery, strange health issues, he saw it all as something to offer up. Every pain and moment of discomfort became a part of a bigger purpose. For him, this wasn't just about acting anymore. It became a personal cross to carry, and he chose to carry it with humility. And it wasn't just physical pain. During one particular scene in Utah, he started having heart palpitations every time he performed it. That was completely new for him. He'd never experienced anything like that before. He even got his heart checked and everything came back normal. No issues, no clear explanation. Just spiritual turbulence showing up as something physical. And in case you're wondering, he's fine. He even thanked the doctors who reached out with concern. But these weren't just coincidences. They were reminders of what he was really stepping into. This wasn't just a show, it was a battleground. Jonathan didn't feel fear though. What he felt was clarity. He began to see what they were filming not as a production but as spiritual warfare. And spiritual warfare always brings resistance. But it also brings something else, divine presence. Jonathan had already been feeling the spiritual weight of playing Jesus, but that moment made it undeniable. This was real. He wasn't just dealing with pressure or criticism. He was stepping into something sacred, and sacred territory always comes with a cost. It became obvious. Portraying Christ meant facing a portion of his suffering. And that meant walking through pain with purpose. Even just a glimpse, even a fraction of what Jesus endured, was enough to transform how Jonathan saw everything. If he could experience even a percent of what Christ did, then maybe he could portray him more authentically. That realization was powerful and heavy, because he also started to wonder, what happens when this ends? What happens when the show wraps? That absence, he said, would likely hit hard, like a kind of spiritual withdrawal, the kind of thing that leaves you hollow for a while. After all this time immersed in something so divine, normal might feel empty. So he started asking himself how he could endure it, this pain, this loss, for something bigger than himself. And the answer was to lean harder into his spiritual life. He doubled down on morning prayers. He attended daily Eucharist. He made confession part of his weekly routine. He always kept a rosary with him. He fasted regularly. He met with a spiritual advisor. All of it was intentional. Not for show. Not to become a better actor, but to become less of himself. To make space for something greater. His biggest prayer was simple: let me get out of the way. Let Jesus shine through. There were moments of deep frustration too. Especially when portraying Jesus as he interacts with his closest friends. There's a scene where Jesus meets Martha and Mary, and even he seems puzzled, like he's trying to understand their grief. Jonathan resonated with that. Sometimes it felt like even Jesus, in his human form, couldn't always make sense of things. Maybe that's what made the portrayal even more honest. Maybe that tension is part of the beauty, that even when you can't fully understand, you still stay present. That's what Jonathan was learning. Obedience doesn't require full comprehension, just full surrender. By this point, Jonathan no longer saw himself as just a performer. He saw himself as a vessel. A chosen vessel, not for comfort but for mission. And mission always comes with battle. He recognized that the ground they were standing on was sacred. This wasn't just countercultural TV, it was something much deeper. A movement. A force that was pushing back against everything the current culture stood for. And to be part of ushering in that kind of truth meant sacrificing for it. That sacrifice came in the form of exhaustion, spiritual attack, and emotional toll. But he stayed in it anyway. Because something about The Chosen felt different. It wasn't just about making a good Christian show. It was about making a genuinely great TV show. One that happened to be deeply spiritual. And because the people creating it cared so much about the message, it naturally became more powerful. It wasn't preachy. It wasn't hollow. It was real. The team behind it were artists, storytellers, and believers. And when God sees that kind of alignment, heart, skill, purpose, he multiplies it. He takes it beyond what humans can do alone. Suddenly, the impact isn't just good storytelling. It becomes divine multiplication, global resonance. And the more resistance they faced, the more it fueled them. Every line delivered, every miracle reenacted, every scene shot, millions of people were being moved. Letters poured in. People said their marriages were healed. Addictions were broken. Prayer lives were reignited. And for Jonathan, every single story made it worth it. That pain had a purpose. That suffering was part of something eternal. And if what he had to go through helped even one soul find peace, it was enough. He hoped his role would serve that goal, to use every bit of his talent to bring people back to God. What's even more remarkable is the way The Chosen crossed lines: political, cultural, spiritual. Jonathan appeared on shows hosted by people with vastly different views, and yet his role was universally respected. Why? Because people could feel the authenticity. They saw that he had no agenda other than love. No ulterior motive. Just a desire to spread the love of God, wherever he could, as quietly and genuinely as possible. That's the power of truth. It's undeniable. It cuts through division. And that's why people from all walks of life have connected with The Chosen. It's not just for Christians. It's for everyone. Behind the scenes, between takes, Jonathan would often pull away from the group. Not to rehearse his lines, but to pray. Not to sharpen his acting, but to center his soul. He wasn't asking God to help him perform better. He was asking God to help him disappear. To help him not get in the way. Because he knew that if people saw him, they might miss him. So even when he was tired, even when he felt spiritually drained, he kept showing up. Because every quiet prayer, every whispered plea for strength, was part of something bigger than himself. That was the hardest part, he said. Not the work itself, but the feeling of being broken in the process. It was like he was being used for something beautiful while being quietly torn apart behind the curtain. But it was in that breaking that something sacred came through. The cracks allowed light in. And maybe that's the secret of The Chosen. It's not just entertainment, it's an experience. A spiritual one. One that came at a cost. For Jonathan, that cost included peace, sleep, even moments of personal despair. But he stayed in the fire. Not for fame. Not for success. For souls. And in one especially emotional moment, caught on camera, Jonathan broke down reflecting on the journey. Not just the success but the sacrifice. And maybe that's the real takeaway. Maybe the attacks he faced weren't about him at all. Maybe they were about who he was representing. Because the enemy doesn't attack when you're off course. He strikes hardest when you're exactly where you're meant to be. And if the cross on that set was struck by lightning, maybe it's because both heaven and hell knew what was really going on. This wasn't fiction. It was spiritual reality. So if you're watching this and your walk with God feels harder, not easier, you're not alone. Sometimes resistance is a sign you're a threat. A threat to darkness. And if darkness is threatened, it means your light is real. Jonathan Roumie never asked for this battle. But when it came, he stayed in it. Not for his name, but for the one he was portraying. And because of that, millions now see Jesus more clearly than they ever have before.